live here.
We live here.
We live here.
We live here.
A project exploring
race,
Class.
power,
poverty,
Systems and the people they touch.
I'm Emmanuel Berry.
And I'm Tim Lloyd.
And from St. Louis Public Radio.
This is We Live Here.
On this episode, the codes of St. Louis.
How we talk about race without actually talking about race.
On our last episode, we interviewed two Brittner High School students.
Right. They were in a reporting class, and their whole project for this school year is to talk with teenagers around St. Louis about race.
And the only reason that I'm bringing this back up is because I wanted to play back this exchange that you, Tim, my co-host, that you had with Brandon, who's a senior at Brittner.
Sure.
And he's talking about the stories that he's heard while interviewing other students.
What stuck out to you?
Definitely just like different people's stories, how you never would think all this stuff really happens until you really hear about it. There's stories saying how like police actually like really do treat them differently. They could get pulled over for no reason at all. Nothing.
Who's the they you're talking about right now?
Anybody who's like African American. They were telling stories how like they've gotten pulled over for just
we hear
walking
him
up down
talking
the
about
street.
they there. They, he keeps using it. And there's a moment where you ask him to, stop and clarify what he means when he's saying that. And, he's honest. He says he means black people.
Of course.
But I've had similar experiences while I'm out reporting where I'd have to ask people, what do you mean when you're saying they? Who are they?
And how's that usually go?
Well, it kind of depends. Sometimes they're like, oh, I'm referring to black people. I'm referring to this type of person. And other times it's those people, Don't you know those people? It's mixed bag.
Yeah, that word, they, especially when talking about race, is used as a code word. This is a way that I would say people who are uncomfortable about race can then talk about race. Right?
Yeah. It's a way kind of to get around it. But they, it's not the only code word. It's a code word that we probably use all the time without realizing it. But there's code everywhere. Like when people say North County.
Or those people.
And, of course, there is the where'd you go to school question, the quintessential coded question for St. Louis.
Otis Johnson, he's an associate professor of education and sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. He says that question is all about status.
Here, the entire where did you go to high school really is code for in what type of neighborhood were you raised or do you come from, and that, of course, is another indicator of social status. Most people aren't, they're not acutely aware. They're acutely aware of race. They're acutely aware of social class to an extent, but in St. Louis, there's this dynamic of place, meaning that people try to understand your race and your social class background according to the place where you grew up or went to school.
Now, the where'd you go to school question is just one example of how we speak in code.
But we wanted to go beyond that and take a look at some of the other ways we talk in code about race.
It won't make a difference. I think that should be about right.
That's coming up right after this break.
That should be about right. Okay. So, for starters, what do you think when you hear North County?
That's Caitlin Petrin. She's our intern, and she's doing this unpleasant thing that we do as journalists called Man on the Street
Nobody
interviews.
likes it.
Yep. Essentially, you just walk up to random people and ask them random questions, and it's super unpleasant.
No, nobody enjoys doing it, which is, of course, why we sent Caitlin to do it.
You're welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you.
We also sent our linguist correspondent, not an official job title, we should point out, Joseph Leahy. Most of you know him as our afternoon newscaster, and some of you may recognize his groundbreaking, shall I say, work that highlighted just how poorly folks in St. Louis, a city founded by the French, actually pronounce French names for local landmarks.
Hey, thanks, Tim. I'm not officially a linguist, but as an undergrad, I did study English in true public radio fashion, and I was happy to explore how we use language here in St. Louis.
Great. Well, let's get to the mechanics. Where did you guys go, and what kind of questions should you ask?
Oh, well, Caitlin went downtown alone, which is one of the more difficult ways to do Man on the Streets. And then the two of us went to downtown Clayton and to South City on Cherokee Street.
Yeah, and I basically had a pad of paper and my microphone, and I walked up to random people who were eating lunch alone, and I asked them if they wanted to answer my questions. So I said, I'm going to throw you some terms that are sort of specific to St. Louis, and I want you to tell me what you think of when I say these words.
Right, so terms like Delmar Boulevard or South County or North City, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, and how are people reacting to this?
It varied. Some people were really excited to talk and just said everything that they wanted to say, and then some people were more suspicious or evasive.
Well, let's get into the tape. Was there a specific term or maybe even an interview that really stood out to you guys?
Yeah, I mean, right on the top, the term Hoosier actually...
Which has nothing to do with Indiana.
No, but here it has a very specific meaning in St. Louis. We got a lot of strong reactions to that.
Hoosier. When I first moved here, like, why does everybody keep talking about the Indiana basketball team? No, I know what it means now. There are names for that everywhere, I think, but that's definitely one unique to St. Louis.
Is it an offensive term that you would refrain from like talking about? Or?
I can be pretty offensive, so. But I think, I don't know if people are offended by it.
What does Hoosier mean though?
I mean, I think it means like kind of country. I think we would say hick in Boston maybe, or like towny, I don't know. Those things are probably offensive too. Please don't record. Yeah, or like a hick, or like someone who, you know.
A white person though, right?
Now that you say that, yeah.
So that was Lo Horvath, who pretty much summed it up and then gave us a little more. But many people had very similar reactions.
Yeah, I interviewed a guy named Matthew Seuss who's from St. Louis, and here's how he said it.
I've always heard it mentioned in like a more country type, he's a Hoosier type situation.
Okay, so what sort of person would it refer
to? Mostly downstate, boot heel type people.
Okay, so is it a pejorative or what?
More of an adjective. I mean, I don't think it was used in a terribly pejorative way.
And then we also spoke with a woman in Clayton named Ann Cody.
It would be somebody that probably is in a lower income bracket, but also that lack of manners is one thing.
Oh, yeah. So
a lack of sophistication.
Thing.
Oh, yes, yeah.
But we are talking about like white people. Hoosiers typically. Like,
yes.
European descendant.
Or, I mean, they can be here a while and still be Hoosier, depending, on their background and how their family behaved.
And then there's this guy, Derek Hopgood, who was with his daughter, Skylar.
That's some racist. Yeah, that's some racist.
It sounds like a show that I watched, Frasier.
Okay.
That's racist. This is a racist term for not blacks, but, whites.
Okay, how have you heard it applied?
Yeah, I heard it a lot of times.
Yeah, how's it, I guess, what does it say about the people it's used for?
Well, it's like a diss word, as you call it, or something that you're trying to make somebody angry by saying it.
White people especially knew the term and what it means, and they always said it was sort of rednecks. If they identified an area, it was South City. A lot of the black people I talked to either didn't know it or knew it was really bad, like Derek Hopgood.
Yeah, I think that's racist guy.
Yeah, pretty much everybody, I think, gets the definition of Hoosier at this point. It's a fairly pejorative, I would say, a way to describe people, mostly white people, often associated with South City, South St. Louis County.
So, I mean, it seems like people had a really ready response for this term Hoosier. What about when you guys were asking other things like West County or North City? I mean, were the answers as clear-cut already?
No, that's when we got into some more murky territory. In our interviews, you started to get this coded language. You ask about a certain area, and like North City or North County, and the characterizations of those areas in the interviews, at least that we did, were high crime or low income. We spoke with Ann Cody, who in her case was substituting class for race. She's from Glendale.
There are pockets down there that are struggling. Yes.
Could you expand on that? What do you mean by struggling? Like if you're on the
lower
street?
income, and consequently they would have less money for education. And how important is education to them when you're in a lower income bracket and have not attended college, etc. If you have families that go to college, they usually want their children to go.
Right. This lower income. You say lower income. Is there a racial component to that too, or is it?
Not necessarily. There are a lot of poor white people.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be color. Yeah.
So she's kind of doing basically everything possible to not talk about race here. Was that common? How else were people getting around just addressing race and being upfront?
Yeah, it was fairly common. One good example is this woman, Barb Hanneisen, who's from Eureka, Missouri. And when I asked her about these areas, she would characterize them according to whether or not she wanted to drive there or what times of day she wanted to drive there. And when I asked her to get specific about why she wouldn't drive there, she would give me an answer like this.
North County? Well, it used to be a thriving community, but right now I would not feel safe going there.
Why is it that North County seems unsafe?
Well, I hear things on the news every day, on the radio and on television, about shootings and whatever, and I don't want to put myself in those places if I can help it.
And then what do you think when you hear Delmar Boulevard?
I don't want to drive there either because I've heard of shootings and robberies, and I don't want to put myself in that place.
And how about Central West End?
I would go there during the day.
So Barb, has this really strong reaction to these places you're listing, North County, Central West End. And she says, she thinks that these areas are unsafe because of what she's hearing on the news.
Right, which I guess is in some ways not really all that surprising. There's this horrible cliche in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads, which is basically you put a crime story at the top of your newscast.
Yeah, a lot of people we spoke with did say, because they don't live in these areas or they don't drive through them and they don't even go to businesses there, their opinions were shaped by what they saw or read or even heard on the news. And we spoke with a guy named Will Johnson when he was on Cherokee Street. But for Will Johnson, he lives in North City and he sees all the news coverage too and had a very different perspective.
Everybody always considers the north side of the city, and that's where I live. As just all-out violent, but if you watch on the news, that's what they say most of the time. It's North City, North City, North City, North City, and they're associating everything with just, and I'm just like a little smaller speck. It may not be as bad where I am, but they, you just hear about the city. The news always putting it in the city all the time. And I've worked out in the county. I've worked for Aaron's. I used to move furniture out in North County. It was all type of stuff going on out there. But it was never reported on. You know what I mean? Lots of times. I've heard about little girls getting killed in apartment complexes that I've delivered to recent, and you never heard anything about it down here in the city. As far as the news, you never heard it.
Just because it's not part of the...
Just because it's not part of... They want to make the city look that bad.
All right, so we're hearing all this tape, but we're not, of course, seeing these people. And I wonder, were there any weird vibes, or how did people's even body language change as you started to get into the questions that really dealt more specifically with race?
Some people were okay with it, but other people seemed angry, started being less open. Their facial expressions would become more closed. I definitely got a couple of glares. Yeah. And one woman actually said, "I see where you're leading me." And then she kept answering questions, but it was sort of a weird moment. And then we would ask this sort of follow-up question, what do you think of stereotypes in St. Louis? Can you think of any others? And Barb Hanneisen, for example, said, "I don't know stereotypes. I don't use stereotypes," when we asked her really explicitly, even though she'd been speaking in stereotypes for much of the interview.
So people, it sounds like, didn't really want to come across as using stereotypes.
Yeah, a little, but also when I asked them about how others might stereotype them, they were really uncomfortable with that.
Interesting.
Yeah, no one really gave a demographic of I would be stereotyped as X. The only people who were blunt actually were white men who I got quite a few answers that were just like, I think people would just call me a white guy.
So, Joseph, you've been doing the Man on the Street gig for a little bit longer. I mean, what was the vibe you were getting?
You know, it really depended. When we were talking about Hoosiers or the Scrubby Dutch, for instance, it was easy. You know, it was easy to talk about ethnicity and all that. But once it became clear we were talking about race, we were talking about black people specifically, people would tiptoe around it. It was a little easier just to hear answers about like low income or about crime or wealth and things like that. And it was difficult to press people to say, well, what do you really mean when you say that?
Yeah.
And also, it was interesting because we were on the street. I mean, men on the streets, as we said, are kind of naturally uncomfortable. But this topic we're talking about, and talking about race and about class, is uncomfortable in the public sphere. I definitely got the sense, and I think, Caitlin, you probably did too, that people were aware of who was around them, and whether it was a white person,
definitely,
you kind of sense that if there was a black person around, that it changed the way they spoke about, their language, and and vice versa. It certainly the context certainly mattered.
Right. So people were kind of looking around to see who's listening.
Yeah, and really, I mean, the takeaway is that on the street, in public, this discussion is one thing, but it's different than, say, we're here in the studio, or if you're in your living room. This language changes as we change where we are.
All right, so talking about race and stereotypes, not the easiest thing to do, especially when you're speaking with a random reporter. I understand. We get it.
But not having these conversations can lead to all sorts of problems. Even simple misunderstandings can have real consequences.
Yeah, just ask Amy Hunter. She's director of racial justice at the YWCA of St. Louis.
And she used to work in the corporate world, big banks, that sort of thing.
Her job was to help these companies not only diversify their workspaces, but she also sometimes found herself in the position of a code breaker.
For example, one day a problem crosses her desk. An African-American employee was on the edge of being let go for constantly being 7 minutes late. So Hunter has a sit down with the employee.
She said, I know that I'm 7 minutes late. And of course, I asked questions like, are you in public transportation? Is this a childcare issue? Things like that. And then when meeting with her, she said, you know what, Amy, I work an hour later. I often miss my lunch. So I'm working enough hours for the 8-hour, 9-hour day that I'm asked to work, actually more than that. And it got really clear very quickly that this was not a conversation about time, as in minutes and hours, that this was a conversation. So even though we were all using the word time, her leader was really translating her tardiness with disrespect. So I don't think she's serious about her job. She's not reliable, dependable. And so we translated that in time, in some cultures, means respect and dependability, where in my culture in particular, it's much more fluid. It doesn't have that same kind of weight. And not just in African American culture, other cultures, communities of color, it doesn't have the same kind of meaning or weight. But that is a really good example of how we're using the same words and we think we're talking, but across racial and cultural lines, those words don't always translate. We talked to the leader, explained that, she wasn't going to be late anymore and that she didn't realize that she was not just hurting his feelings, but, sending a message that she wasn't serious about her job. And he agreed that she was there working there later and felt hurt by her actions. So it was a great dialogue to say, this is how sometimes words matter.
And that idea, words matter, is a big part of the work she's doing now at the YWCA of St. Louis.
For the past 5 years, she's taught a class called Witnessing Whiteness.
It's about bringing people together to talk about race. And since Ferguson, Hunter says she's seen a huge increase in interest.
And we should say about this class, we kind of assumed that it would be a mixed class with, white and black people talking about race.
That turned out to be a false assumption.
Hunter made the classes either all white or all people of color on purpose.
what race scholars would say is that when we have cross-racial dialogue, people of color are doing a lot of the work in educating. What we would offer is that white people can learn about racism without people of color being in the room. And quite honestly, they're usually in all white spaces. Like if they think about their dinner tables or their clubs or organizations or even their neighborhoods. So this really isn't as foreign as it may sound. Like people are often in same race spaces. We've just been intentional to say these are the spaces we're providing. I think it also sets up what community looks like. So we have some assumptions that some people get this and some people don't. Our approach is that all people want to eliminate racism.
So I went to a college that was majority white and then transferred to another school where I was in a program that was majority white. And we were talking about, it was a program that was all about like social justice and, civic engagement work. And I never thought about the fact that I was doing a lot of the lifting in these classes in these spaces, and it annoyed me to know. And it was one of my biggest complaints when I left the school. I was like, this is ridiculous. You guys need to fix the way you teach that. And I never thought about the idea of it being a separate space and about that self-teaching.
But even in these separate spaces, this whole idea of words meaning different things to different people is a constant theme.
We use words like good, like I'm a good person, this is a good school, this is a safe school, this is a good neighborhood. And usually good is synonymous with white. It doesn't have to be, but it usually means that when we're talking in code language. And so we get to have these conversations that all white people are good, for example, so we can stop kind of separating ourselves out from good white people and bad white people to say we've all been racially scripted with some miseducation, and we've all been hurt by racism. So if we're all hurt, then our strategy is to educate and love each other within space.
Yeah. What about a word just like community? How does that interpretation change from an African American resident versus a white resident?
Interesting, because community is a great word. We at one of the companies I worked for, one of the taglines was "We're in your community," and I said, "Well,
are you in my community?"
You're not in my community.
Right.
I don't know about that.
But community has a broad stretch, right? So we often talk about the Black community as if it's a neighborhood. And so sometimes we're saying community, people are really talking about their neighborhood, like where they live or the city that they live in. But I'd offer that in Black space in any way, it has a broader concept. So I belong to the Black community, whether I live in Black space or not. They're still my people and still my community. Or my mother could live in Black space and that's still my community because she resides there and she belongs to me. Does that make sense? And so it has a much broader reach. So we see things like community. We have to be really clear that we're not always talking about just our neighborhood, that we are talking about kind of a fictive kinship, if you will, an outreach of where we personally reside.
Another code word that Hunter says is common is safety.
And you'll remember that safety came up earlier in the episode when Caitlin and Joe were doing the man on the street interviews. People were talking about safety as a way to define different parts of town.
So people would say things like Chesterfield is safe, and then maybe North St. Louis is not safe.
Hunter says safety can mean different things to different people based on their race.
My first experience with this actually was an undergrad, and I was going to work for a company that was going to do door knocking for kind of Greenpeace kind of initiatives. And I told my dad, but it's in a safe neighborhood. And he explained, what is safe? To white people is not always safe to you, which as a parent, I've also then had to explain to my children what is safe in white space is not necessarily safe for Black people. So times when you might get stopped or times when one of the companies I worked for, they did a lot of door knocking, and a lot of times the African American and Latino people would have to go to the police station prior to knocking on doors to tell them that they were going to be in the neighborhood so people wouldn't call the police on them. And so although it is perceived as safe, it does call the question of safe for whom?
Okay, so we're talking about folks going to the YWCA to learn more about race.
But most of the time when, these code words come up in conversations about race, they don't happen in the safe space like the YWCA.
They happen at bus stops or at the office or at schools, or maybe you're hanging out with your kids at the playground on the weekend. So we wondered how Hunter dealt with race-based code when she's not teaching a class.
Usually my first thought, not what I audibilize, but my first thinking is, I'm sorry that happened to you. Right? Because something happened. Like we're all born wonderful and then something happens. And so usually, So usually if somebody is saying something that is harsh to hear or is mistaken, right? Then my first thought is, I'm sorry that happened to you. And then in a loving way, I reach for them. I got a really good question the other day of, well, the Japanese were interned. This was a good example. The Japanese were interned here in this country and they got over it. Why can't black people get over it? And so my first thought, sorry that happened to you. And then I gently said, so I'm not sure that 300 years of chattel slavery and then 80 more years of Jim Crow and, it's only been about 50 years since, the civil rights movement is exactly the same as 3 years of internment, although that was horrific and they did receive reparations. I don't think those are maybe the same kind of comparison. And then he said, okay. But it was, I get that people really don't want to fail at race and race dialogue, but a lot of times people just don't know what to say or where to go. And quite honestly, what keeps people from having race dialogue freely is the fear that they're going to say something wrong or be labeled a racist. And so Witnessing Whiteness gives them that practice to say everything they've ever wanted to say, ask any question they ever wanted to ask, and get some clear direction. And also the understanding that we're all going to make mistakes. So I would love to tell you they end this group after 10 sessions, perfect individuals. But the reality of the situation is this is a process. It's not an event. We're going to make mistakes along the way. This is messy, and that's okay. But we've built enough community to be okay with making a mistake and still having people who support us and work with us through our process.
We just did a show about how what kids see in school can shape the way that they think about race. And one of the points that came up, right, yeah. And so one of the points that came up is that we asked, this great academic out at UC Berkeley, the perception is that kids are more likely to change, that adults can't change. It strikes me that some of what you're telling us is, and he responded to us, I should say, that, listen, it stands, intuitively we think that, but that's not actually what the research bears out. And it seems to me that what you're describing is a very real-world example of adults having like a light bulb moment, as the cliche goes, that they're going, oh, I get it now. Or at least I get some of it now. I mean, is that right?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. It is really wonderful that we have the civil rights activists here with us right now to guide us through these moments, and the young people who are pushing for change. I think, but what is true is prior to Ferguson, we were having lots of race conversations with very young children who, because there wasn't a civil rights movement on TV, really have been raised in environments where they honestly think that being in all white spaces like the suburbs is normal, and that people of color just don't work hard or try hard, and that's why they're not in those spaces. And so I think the ways for some adults, where if you were alive during the civil rights movement, it was obvious when they were water hosing children and adults and sicking dogs on people that was wrong, that we've had at least 2, almost 3 generations of people that have not even witnessed anything like that prior to Ferguson. So we haven't been having those conversations for quite some time. So kids are only as good as the adults. And if the adults are having aha moments, then that will translate into households for children. Children can't save us from ourselves. We're still here kicking and screaming, so we can still learn. And kids need help too, because they're really trying to figure this out.
That's the answer he gave us too.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I've noticed in talking with youth and talking kind of with millennials is that people say we're a very race conscious, group of people, but we lack the language and academic understanding of these systems. So we'll say things about being more accepting and stuff, but we actually have no capacity to talk about race beyond the very front line of that's unjust, but we really don't dive into those systems or understand them. Yeah, I mean, does that make sense what I'm saying?
It completely makes sense. I was in a class on Saturday and said, I think people have been doing a really good job lumping. And in my generation, I would say, sorting out which black people are which, right? So are you a Cosby black? Are you a Good Times black? And that has been, well, I'm willing to talk to the Cosby blacks because I've seen them on television, but the Good Times blacks I'm afraid of. And so having those kind of conversations about, how we get scripted either through the media or through our households. I think the other piece that we miss sometimes is that if we're not having dialogue, sometimes our silence is sending a message too. And so if you're white and you're not having people of color over your house, your kids are also getting a message that people of color don't come to my house, that they're not welcomed, or that my parents don't like them, or it's not acceptable. So I think we're usually saying, well, if our parents didn't say the N-word in our house, then they didn't have any, racialized tendencies, when in reality of the situation is often they are sending a message even through their silence, and kids are always picking up on that. And I think the millennials have picked up on some of that. But you're right, the deeper conversations of, well, I go to school with a Black person, but they're really not my friend. I just kind of know them. Or even the conversations about dating, which is kind of the one that I get the most from millennials and people of my generation. So a lot of white people walk up to me and tell me they've had an interracial relationship. Like, I dated a Black guy once. And I'm like, well, I dated a Black guy once too. And they don't make you taller, smarter, faster. That doesn't cure it. And I mean, that's a great code for, I have the capacity and ability to love across the racial line. That's really what they're trying to say. I'm on your team. I'm a good person. But the practice of just being able to say, I'm on your team and I'm a good person, comes out in, I've interracially dated, for example. So.
I'm curious, you said you're from St. Louis, born and raised. When someone asks you where you went to school, what do you say?
It depends how much fun I want to have, right? So I went to 2 high schools and 3 colleges, but sometimes I'll pick a high school I didn't go to just to get a response. Yeah. I never ask that question. It is so unimportant to me what high school you went to or how much money your parents had, which is really the question. It does not determine who you are, define who you are for me. But I know it means something to somebody else. I'd like to imagine we could be close without our high school being on display. So I change it up.
It always strikes me too that that part of, as someone who's newer to town, I mean, I've been here for close to 3 years now, that question, it's treated by some folks who grew up here as sort of being this cute, like St. Louis thing, and they never think, they never peel it back, and say, well, what's underneath that? That it's almost like this like hometown pride, like, oh, that's a St. Louis thing, what school did you go to? Why do you think that is?
Maybe we just can't imagine how to build relationships quickly with one another without asking a question. What I would say in some cultures, transactional relationships is how we build relationships. So I give you something or give you a question and you answer the question back. What I'd offer in some communities, if we have a relationship, you can ask me any question you'd like. And so I think what we're really going for, what we'd really like, is to be close to one another. And that takes relationship building, not transactions.
So the problem with talking in code is it makes it harder to build relationships.
And even when we think we're using the same words and communicating clearly, sometimes we're not.
We know we're not the only folks out there talking about race and hearing these codes. So what codes do you hear, and what do you think they mean? You can tweet us using the hashtag WeLiveHereSTL.
We also have a texting line. You can text us at 314-266-5192.
So we've done a lot of talking about race.
Yeah, we've traveled along Lindbergh Boulevard.
And we've talked about how going to an all-black or all-white school can shape how kids think about race.
But we said from the beginning that this is a show about systems and people.
And we've got some systems to untangle.
We're going to spend the next few episodes digging into the criminal justice system.
First, we'll look at how paying a debt to society often comes with interest.
We Live Here is produced by me, Emmanuel Berry.
And me, Tim Lloyd. Shula Newman is our editor, and Margie Freivogel is the editor of St. Louis Public Radio.
Our theme music was composed by Casey Morgan from St. Louis Public Radio. This is We Live Here.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.